The world saw a woman who conquered everything. Only I knew she was built on someone else's grave. That night, I wasn't a millionaire, or a visionary, or a name in a magazine. I was just a sinner begging a ghost to answer me. They say the richest sound in a mansion is silence. But on that night, the silence pressed against my ribs like a verdict. And even the hum of the climate control felt like a whisper telling me the truth I had avoided for years. I stood at the edge of the foyer, where the lights were always kept warm for guests who no longer came, and the marble under my bare feet held the cold like a memory, so complete and unforgiving that I felt it rising through my bones until my hands began to tremble around the letter whose paper had already known my tears. The chandeliers above me glittered with a sterile kind of beauty, every crystal an obedient star, every reflection a careful lie. And the house, my proud, gilded testament to victory, seemed to tilt slightly, as if listening for a confession I had promised myself I would never speak aloud. The air smelled faintly of lilies, from an arrangement that the staff always refreshed whether I was home or not. And their sweetness made me nauseous because it reminded me of hospital corridors I had once walked with a smile that did not belong to me, promising donations that washed my conscience just enough to sleep. Tonight, the flowers were too strong, or maybe I had finally become too weak, because each breath scraped like sand across the inside of my chest. I could hear the grandfather clock in the library counting out the seconds, steady and indifferent, and I found myself watching its rhythm play in the glass of the framed magazine covers lining the hallway, the ones that had called me a miracle, a visionary, a woman who had built an empire with nothing but grit, when in truth, I knew exactly who had bled for the first brick. I had chosen this spot, between the portrait I commissioned of a version of me who looks benevolent and brave, and the mirror that presides over the staircase like a judge, because it forces me to stand between who I pretended to be and who I actually am. The letter quivered as if it could feel the distance between those two women shrinking at last. The envelope had grown soft at the corners from being opened and closed too many times, and the handwriting on its face, my own, looked careful to the point of cowardice, like I thought neatness might redeem the words inside. Every time I read them, I reshaped a sentence, shifted a comma, changed a verb, as though grammar could absolve me where decency had failed. "If you can forgive me, I'll give up everything," I whispered. Not to the house, not to the clock or the flowers or the portrait, but to the memory that lived in this letter like a flame behind glass. A memory that had warmed me when I wanted to believe I was good and scorched me when the headlines sounded too much like hymns. The sentence left my mouth thin and breaking, a thread stretched to snapping. And when it echoed down the hallway, the echo returned heavier than the sound that made it, as if the walls had added back everything I had tried to take out of it. My arrogance, my fear, my tightly folded regret. I could have shouted, could have fallen to the floor and sobbed until the marble drank me dry, but I kept my voice low because I was afraid that if I let it come out full, the whole house would finally understand me, and I would have nowhere left to hide. There are nights when memory is a lock and a key and a door all at once, when it opens the past not gently but with the rude swing of a storm wind, and that was the kind of night this was. I saw my first office again, with its second-hand desk and the chipped mug that declared me a boss before I had earned it. And I saw the first check with too many zeros, the kind that turns a person into a creature of appetite. And I saw her eyes when I told her we would be unstoppable, when we promised each other not to let money turn us into strangers. In that flash, I felt the thrill that comes before a sin, the way the road shines right before rain. And I felt, too, the tiny crack in my chest that had widened year by year into a canyon. No gift, no gala, no grateful photograph could bridge. The mirror above the stairs had always been flattering, the kind of antique that softens edges and turns fatigue into elegance. But tonight, it had stripped itself of mercy. It showed me as I am when the cameras are gone. A woman curated into emptiness, a face trained to land on angles that say sincerity, while the eyes dodge their own reflection. My skin looked stretched across a story I refused to tell, my mouth rehearsed around kindnesses I could not feel, and there was a hollowness along my cheekbones that no sculptor would claim as artistry. It was the hollowness of rooms after a party, of plates without crumbs, of applause without a reason. I tried to smile at myself and failed. And in that failure, a wave of panic rose, because I understood that the distance between performance and person had finally collapsed, and I stood at the collision point. I slid a finger beneath the flap and opened the letter again, careful as a surgeon, as if I were trying not to injure the past more than I already had. The paper rasped against my skin with that sound that belongs to secrets and wills and patient forms. And then my own words stared up at me, ink dense and deliberate, no smudges this time, as though neatness could hold me together. I had written about the beginning, and about what I told myself when the money started appearing, and about the night I made the worst decision with the calmest hands, and the first morning after when the sun was offensively bright, and I told myself that survival was noble no matter the cost. I had written about the charities that taught me how to turn checks into absolution, and the speeches that taught me how to cry on cue, and the way my chest ached when people called me generous because it felt like they were praising a thief for leaving a little behind. The letter weighed more than it should have, and perhaps that was because of what it contained, or perhaps because of who it was meant for. I held it and felt the mass of every unslept hour, every deleted draft of an apology, every time I had almost dialed a number and then placed the phone back in its cradle like a gun I was afraid to fire. The mansion around me hissed with its own comfort, ducts pushing air the temperature of a lie, refrigerators humming behind panels that made them look like art, fireplaces that could conjure flames with a discreet switch. And for the first time, I understood that comfort can be a kind of prison when the door is upholstered and the walls are hung with your best photographs. All of it, the square footage, the views, the perfect stones arranged under my feet, felt like a costume that had shrunk in the wash, stitching biting into skin. I stepped closer to the mirror because I wanted to see the exact second when a person knows she has gone too far to pretend any longer. My eyes were red along the rims, but not with grief. Not yet, but with the irritation of truth pushing through the lacquer I had painted over everything. The woman who looked back at me had the right dress for contrition, a simple silk slip in a color that photographs well in low light, but she did not have the right heart for innocence. She had a heart that had negotiated for years, bartered away the pieces that still felt, settled like a clever attorney for the smallest admission possible. I pressed the letter to my chest like a relic, and felt, absurdly, as if maybe some of that ink could pass into me and write something better where my excuses had been. I thought of the nights when headlines said my name like it was the name of a city, and I thought of the quiet morning after the first scandal broke, when I managed to smile on television without my voice shaking. And I thought of the applause that followed me like a train, and I realized how exhausted I was from dragging it wherever I went. Applause is heavier than guilt because it insists you keep performing. The marbles cold, rose and rose until my legs remembered the language of surrender, and I felt them fold. I did not fall beautifully. I did not arrange myself like a sculpture. I knelt the way people do when the body takes over and says enough, and the letter bent across my sternum with a protesting crease, a second spine. If you can forgive me, I'll give up everything, I said again. And this time the words were not a performance, not a prayer to the cameras, not a strategy to win back a market that had begun to doubt me. They were the plainest truth I had left, and the moment I spoke them I understood the terrible arithmetic of that promise, because everything included not only the tangible wealth, the deeds, the shares, the patents, but also the armor I had crafted out of praise. The echo returned softer, as though the walls had decided to handle the sentence with care, and I wanted to believe that was a sign. But I have spent too long studying the way people make meaning out of coincidence, and I have sponsored too many illusions to trust a friendly echo. Memories came then the way rain comes to a hot street, sudden and relieving and violent. The first prototype on a wobbly table, the handwritten list of names to call, the panic when the money ran too thin, the blessing of the first investor, the hunger that praised me for refusing to sleep, the hand I should have held, the signature I should never have written. They stacked on top of each other until I could not tell which one hurt most. And I realized that peace is not something wealth denies you because wealth is evil, but because wealth can distract you so beautifully that you forget the only door that opens to peace is confession. And I had kept that door locked so long the hinges screamed when I touched them even in my mind. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until the stars came. And when the stars faded, I was still there on the floor. The house was still listening, and the letter was still warm from my skin. I wanted to believe that if I could stop time inside this hallway, if I could keep the clock from reaching the next hour, I might avoid the future that had been stalking me with increasing patience. But the clock continued, and the lilies continued to insist upon their sweetness, and the night refused to be shorter simply because I was afraid. I lifted the letter again, and told myself that after I read it one more time, I would do the brave thing, and I understood how many times I had made that bargain with myself, and how every repetition had made me a little worse, a little more practiced at being the kind of woman who could look straight into a mirror and not see what was obvious. The paper shook in my hands, as if it could sense the verge, and I thought of the face I needed to see, and the voice I needed to hear, and the debt I could not pay with money. And I felt something calm settle under my ribs, a quiet that did not belong to the house or the lilies or the clock, but to the smallest part of me that still knew the difference between a life and a performance of a life. I stood, I steadied, I breathed through the ache. And then, as I turned the envelope over to check the front again, maybe to delay and maybe to confirm, I saw the neat lines of my own handwriting and felt the cold move from the floor up into my throat, because at last I remembered what I had done in a moment of panic and grandiosity days ago when I first wrote these pages, and the blood left my face as if it had been called elsewhere. The letter I was clutching so desperately wasn't addressed to anyone alive, yet the name written on it had just reappeared in my life. They called me America's Miracle Woman. They lit me like a saint and mic'd me like a president. They wrote op-eds about my grit and my golden touch and the way my smile could calm a volatile market. But underneath every headline I could hear a smaller, truer voice that refused to quiet down. The one that called me exactly what I was. A liar wearing the kind of dress that turns confession into strategy. In the beginning, the empire felt like a fairground rising overnight, a city of bright tents where everything had my name on it and every aisle smelled like possibility. And I remember the first flagship store on Fifth Avenue where the mannequins were arranged in poses that suggested momentum and mercy in the same breath, where the walls hosted color like a celebration, and the sales associates were trained to say my story as if it were a prayer. And when I walked through those doors on opening day with a press line curving like a river past velvet ropes, I felt the floor itself hum, as though the city had decided to lend me its electricity for a while. By the time the second and third brands launched, athleisure that promised discipline, couture that promised transcendence, cosmetics that promised radiance without effort, the narrative had been baked into every bottle and seam. A myth you could hold and wear, the kind of myth America likes best because it flatters the mirror and forgive speed. Charity made me legitimate in the eyes of people who need mercy to look expensive. So I learned how to build a gala the way an architect learns light. I learned where to place the cameras so that generosity gleamed without glare. I learned to speak about impact with the calm cadence of a surgeon, and I learned which causes would braid most beautifully with the brand. Women in business, girls in STEM, scholarships for dreamers whose applications read like the childhood I rewrote for myself. Until the awards began to stack on mantelpieces I barely visited, glass triangles and engraved circles and heavy plaques that flashed when a camera passed, each one a polished stone on the altar of my public absolution. Interviews became a second home, a room I could enter with the ease of muscle memory, and I knew how to tilt my chin toward sympathy and how to widen my eyes for wonder. I knew which anecdotes made producers lean forward and which numbers made anchors smile, and I had the good fortune or the good training to cry exactly once per segment in a way that read as gratitude rather than guilt. They said I was self-made because that was the script we all preferred. The bootstrap fairy tale in a designer heel, and the magazines loved to place me on their covers with headlines that made the economy sound like something I had charmed into good behavior. The woman who taught luxury to care, how she turned nothing into a billion, the new face of ethical glamour. And when they asked for childhood photos, we provided the acceptable ones, the ones where I look hungry but brilliant, the ones where the American flag flutters in the corner as if it were auditioning to be part of my logo. I stood in studio kitchens learning how to hold a mug like a friend, and in business sections learning how to hold a pen like a prophecy. And every time the red light went on, I became a better version of the person I could almost believe I had been. The cameras loved me because I had trained them to. Or maybe because cameras always love someone who believes that adoration is oxygen, and the public loved me because I gave them a story where they could purchase a fragment of my supposed courage along with a lipstick, a jacket, a bag that promised to carry not only their belongings, but also their possibility. Yet the truth made a noise I could hear even during ovations, a thin mechanical clicking behind the music, like the sound a clock makes when it's about to strike an hour you dread. And that clicking followed me down carpets and hallways and into green rooms where publicists pressed powder into my face as if they could close my pores to conscience. Behind every smiling photo was a crime I could not confess. Behind every ribbon I cut was the memory of a ribbon I had severed across someone else's future. And the cameras, for all their sophistication, could not catch the way my stomach clenched when a young founder told me I was her North Star, or the way my throat tightened when a scholarship recipient thanked me for believing in her, because I could feel the exact weight of the belief I had stolen to afford this moment. I learned to breathe through it like an athlete, counting the seconds of the inhale so I could land a paragraph without betraying tremor. And I learned to place my hands just so, because hands are the most eloquent liars when they have practiced enough. The empire became a geography you could chart, headquarters in a tower that climbed into weather I never saw from the street, warehouses where rows of boxes looked like disciplined hope, pop-up events where lines wound around the block and women cried when they saw me, because I was proof, supposedly, that the impossible could be styled and sold. We had an app that understood desire with unnerving fluency. We had a philanthropic arm that turned tax codes into halos. We had a board that applauded my instincts even when those instincts were just fear with good posture. And we had a calendar in which there was no room for the past unless it could be repurposed into triumph. When I stood on stage at conferences with acronyms that sounded like futures, I told the story of my climb in a voice that wore exhaustion like a jewel. And I watched audiences lean into the kind of pain that is easy to admire because it ends in a product you can photograph. and each applause break felt like a stamp on a passport that kept me traveling farther from the place where honesty was still spoken. What none of them knew, what I would not let myself know except in the hour when night hangs heaviest, was that the bones of my empire belonged to someone else, that the blueprint I marketed as my singular vision had been drawn by a hand I should have protected, and that every staircase I ascended had been engineered with measurements taken from a friendship I vandalized for speed. I built my fortune on someone else's dream, and then mastered the art of calling it innovation. And when doubt crept close, I threw money at it until it smiled for the camera. There is a particular cruelty to celebrating yourself in rooms where you feel the ghost of another woman's laughter, the way it can braid into your sentences and make you stumble on the word we. And there were nights after the awards when I sat in the back of my car with its quiet leather and its polite lights, and I pressed my palms to my knees to stop the shaking that came when I pictured her eyes the last time they believed me. The magazines kept arriving because magazines prefer momentum. The networks kept calling because networks prefer a face that knows where its light is, and my team kept polishing the story because stories pay dividends when they scale, and I kept feeding the legend because legends are hungry, and because stepping down felt like stepping into a hole that had no bottom. I told myself that success granted me the right to rewrite the past in cleaner lines. I told myself that my philanthropy balanced the ledger. I told myself that she would have forgiven me if she could see how many jobs I created, how many scholarships I funded, how many laws I lobbied for that protected women like the one I failed to be. But the private arithmetic never changed. I had taken what was not mine, and I had learned to sing over the sound of it. The worship began to scare me more than the threat of scandal, because worship crystallizes the lie until it looks like truth, and there were days when I could feel the adoration harden around me like amber, preserving a performance so perfectly that I feared I would never move freely again. At signings, I felt my smile become a mask that had fused to my skin, and at galas, I watched donors stare at me as if I were both the cause and the cure. And at home, in the clean light of morning, I would hold a trophy and wonder how many degrees separate admiration from anesthesia. I told myself that one day I would put everything right, that I would speak the unspeakable and pay back the unpayable. And I moved that day forward in my calendar the way a coward moves a meeting he dreads, convincing himself that next week he will be braver. Next quarter the market will be kinder. Next year the world will be ready for the truth. And then the world decided for me, not with a headline or a subpoena or the sudden mutiny of my board, but with something far more precise and terrifying. Something that slipped under the locked door of my story and sat down across from me with a calm I recognized like a scent I had loved and lost. I saw her work appear on a runway I did not own. I heard a laugh in a crowd that I had taught myself to forget. I watched a silhouette walk past a glass wall and felt my lungs refuse their contract with air, because in a single impossible second, I understood that the dream I had stolen had not died in the wreckage where I left it, that it had grown in secret and learned my steps, and then rewritten them in a gait more graceful than mine. And when I turned to face the source of that cinematic dread, I saw a woman wearing my legacy, like it had always fit her better. And the dream I built my empire on walked back into my life, smiling with my stolen success, as if it had been hers all along. It took one whisper to destroy the illusion I had built for 20 years. A single word slipped between the applause and the sound of clinking champagne glasses, slicing through the armor of success I had spent half my life polishing, until it gleamed like absolution. The gala was supposed to celebrate me, the woman who had made failure fashionable to overcome, the face of empowerment, the saint of reinvention. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers that looked like captured constellations, and the city beyond the glass windows glowed with the kind of arrogance only New York can afford. My dress was custom-made, the color of forgiveness, the neckline measured to suggest confidence without invitation. Photographers had already taken more pictures of me than they would of the governor that night, and each flash made my smile settle deeper into place, a reflex carved by years of repetition. I laughed where I was supposed to, complimented people whose names I didn't need to remember, and spoke about the future as if it were something I still deserved. The air smelled of orchids and ambition. Waiters floated past like clockwork, their trays reflecting the chandeliers in small, perfect bursts of light. I had learned long ago that galas were theater. The script was written in flattery, the applause paid for in donations, and I was both the star and the spectacle. The charity tonight was a foundation under my name, funding young female designers. It was the kind of irony the universe seemed to enjoy. I was being honored for empowering women to own their dreams, if they only knew whose dream I had stolen to stand here. I remember turning toward the main table when I saw him. A man I didn't recognize, standing just beyond the halo of light, near the exit doors. He wasn't dressed like the other guests. No tuxedo, no bow tie, no eager expression that hinted at networking intentions. He looked misplaced in that sea of curated wealth, wearing a dark suit that belonged more to a courtroom than a ballroom. But what caught me wasn't his appearance. It was the way he was watching me, not with admiration, not even with judgment, with recognition. There's a specific chill that comes from being known by a stranger. I felt it crawl up the back of my neck, cold and slow. I excused myself from a conversation I can't remember now, and made my way toward him, my heels whispering across the marble. The closer I got, the more I noticed the small details, the steady calm in his posture, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the confidence of someone who wasn't there to be impressed. When I stopped in front of him, he didn't smile. He didn't even introduce himself. He simply leaned forward until I could smell the faint trace of rain on his coat, and he whispered one name, Anna. The sound of it was a door slamming open in a house I thought I'd abandoned. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. My smile faltered, but only for the length of a camera flash. Then I did what I had trained myself to do when panic tried to show its face. I smiled wider. My hand, still holding a champagne flute, stayed perfectly steady, though my pulse thundered against the glass stem. The name was louder in my head than the music, louder than the applause. Anna. He straightened and looked at me with a softness that didn't match the cruelty of the moment. You remember her, he said. Not a question, more like a verdict. I forced a small laugh, the kind of polished sound that deflects. I meet so many people, I said, rehearsed, flawless. But he tilted his head slightly, pity flickering across his expression. Not like her, he replied. Every part of me wanted to turn away, to pretend this was a misunderstanding, a coincidence. But coincidences don't carry the weight of old sins. He knew what he was saying. He knew who he was saying it for. And suddenly, the noise of the room fell away. The laughter, the speeches, the soft orchestral background, all of it dimmed into the dull hum of white noise. The spotlight was still on me, but I felt like I was standing in the dark. I excused myself again, this time from reality, and walked toward the terrace for air. The cold hit me with the same cruelty as the name had. My reflection in the glass door trembled, as though it too was ashamed to face me. I gripped the railing and stared at the skyline, those towers built on greed and glass, realizing how much they resembled me. I had spent my life constructing something beautiful from betrayal, and now one word had cracked the foundation. I didn't notice when he joined me outside until he spoke again. She remembers everything. That line burned colder than the wind. I turned sharply, my mouth parting as if to demand clarity, but his expression silenced me. His eyes didn't hold threat. They held truth. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, it just exists, patient and unstoppable. "Who are you?" I managed. He smiled faintly, the way someone smiles when they already know you won't like the answer. "A messenger," he said, his tone almost kind. "And she wanted you to know. Time didn't erase you. It just gave her power." Before I could speak, he stepped back towards the door. For a moment, his hand rested on the handle, as if he were deciding whether to leave me a little more broken or entirely undone. "Tell me what this means," I said, my voice breaking despite every layer of control I had rehearsed over decades of deception. He turned his head slightly, enough for me to see that his eyes had the calm of someone who had already delivered judgment. "You'll find out soon," he said. Then he was gone, melted back into the crowd, swallowed by sequins and conversation and laughter that suddenly sounded cruel. I searched the room for him, but the faces blurred, and every flash of a camera looked like a signal flare I couldn't decode. Inside, people were still raising glasses in my name. The charity director called me to the stage for my closing speech, but my mind was still out on that terrace, standing next to a stranger who had spoken a name I swore I'd buried beneath millions of dollars and miles of reputation. I heard my cue, felt the microphone pressed into my hand, and stepped up under the lights. The audience applauded, unaware that something inside me had already begun to die. As I looked out over the sea of expectant faces, I could still hear his voice cutting through the music, quiet but absolute, an echo I couldn't silence. "She remembers everything." That night, I gave a speech about second chances, but all I could think about was the first person who would never give me one. Every empire has a foundation. Mine was betrayal, and I laid the first brick with my own hands. When I think back to my 20s, the images arrive like film reels that have been replayed too many times. Edges burned, colors bleeding into each other, sound skipping where it hurts most. The air back then smelled like cheap coffee and wet pavement. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with walls so thin I could hear my neighbor's alarm before my own. And every morning, I would wake to the echo of my own hunger. But it wasn't hunger for food. It was hunger for a name, for a place in a world that didn't care who I was unless I gave it something to remember me by. That was when I met Anna. She wasn't like me, at least not at first glance. Where I was sharp edges and impatience, she was soft confidence and quiet precision. I used to joke that she thought in blueprints and I thought in fire. Together, we were chaos and control, and that combination built something neither of us could have built alone. We met at a startup incubator downtown, two girls sitting in the back of a seminar on venture capital, both scribbling ideas on napkins because we couldn't afford the glossy notebooks everyone else used. I remember the way she looked at me when I told her I wanted to design clothes that didn't just fit bodies, but told stories. She smiled and said, "Then let's build the language." From that moment, we were inseparable. Days bled into nights in that tiny shared office, where the floor was always covered with sketches, bolts of fabric, and half-empty coffee cups that smelled like dreams refusing to die. We worked until the sun came up. Not because we had deadlines, but because we couldn't stop. She had a mind that saw symmetry in everything, and I had the kind of ambition that refused to sleep. I used to believe that together we were unstoppable. The first investor came through a friend of a friend, a man who smelled of expensive aftershave and opportunity. He saw promise in our work, but more than that, he saw division waiting to happen. Investors are predators in silk ties. They can sense imbalance before it even exists. He asked for a meeting with the leader, and when Anna and I showed up together, his smile tightened just slightly. "Every ship needs a captain," he said, pouring whiskey we couldn't afford to drink. "Who makes the final calls?" We both laughed it off that night. We told ourselves we were equals, but when the funding contract came, my name was listed first. Alphabetical order, they said. But something about seeing it printed that way did something to me. It whispered a dangerous idea. Maybe this empire could be mine. From there, it happened slowly, almost politely. Tiny omissions, small lies told to protect momentum. I began scheduling meetings without her because she was busy with the creative side. I started answering emails meant for both of us. When journalists asked who started the company, I said we at first, but my voice lingered too long on the I. Anna didn't notice at first. Or maybe she did, but she trusted me too much to imagine I'd hurt her. When our designs caught the attention of a major investor group, everything changed. They loved the vision, but wanted control. 51% of the company in exchange for expansion. Anna said no. She believed in what we built. She wanted to grow, but not at the cost of our souls. I told her she was being naive, that success required sacrifice. She said, "Then maybe it's not success you want, it's power." That night, I didn't sleep. Her words rang through my mind until dawn, and when I walked into that next meeting alone, something inside me had already decided what kind of person I was willing to become. I told the investors that Anna was stepping down, that she couldn't handle the scale, that I had her blessing to move forward. They didn't ask for proof. They didn't need it. Greed speaks a universal language. The contract was drawn up, and with a single signature, I turned partnership into possession. I stole her designs, her vision, her future, and then I hired lawyers to make it legal. The look on her face when she found out still haunts me. The shock, the confusion, the disbelief that the person she trusted most had turned her into collateral damage. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She just asked one question. Why? I didn't answer. Because how do you explain to someone that the fear of being nothing can make you destroy everything that ever mattered? She left that night, packed up her things from the studio, and disappeared from my daily life, leaving behind sketches that would later become the cornerstone of my empire. Every magazine cover that followed, every standing ovation, every red carpet moment was built on lines drawn by her hands. I told myself she would understand eventually that one day when we were both rich, she'd forgive me. But forgiveness doesn't grow in the shadow of betrayal. It dies there. The world crowned me a visionary. They said I had redefined success for women, that I had turned fashion into philosophy. I smiled through every interview, every photo shoot, every compliment that should have been hers. Sometimes I caught myself almost saying her name in interviews, but I learned to choke it back, replacing it with generic phrases like my early collaborator or someone I once worked with. Even in erasing her, I was careful to do it gracefully. Months passed. Then one morning, as I was leaving a meeting, my phone buzzed with a notification from a news alert. I didn't recognize the headline at first. Just her name. It felt like someone had dropped ice water down my spine. The words blurred together. Car accident. Missing. Presumed dead. I remember sinking into the back seat of my car, the city blurring beyond the window, my reflection staring back at me with the same painted calm I showed the world. But this wasn't grief. It was something uglier. It was relief laced with horror. I had destroyed her career, her dream, and now it seemed her life had followed. The news coverage faded after a few weeks. The police never found a body. The story was swallowed by the next tragedy, the next scandal, the next big thing. I told myself it was over, that she was gone, that ghosts don't come back. I built walls around that belief, tall and polished, and decorated them with awards and headlines until they looked like monuments instead of prisons. And for 20 years, those walls held until that night at the gala, when a stranger whispered her name and made them crumble. Months after I stole her dream, the world reported that Anna had vanished in a car accident, her body never found. I told myself it was the end, never realizing it was only the beginning. The dead don't come back. But that night, she did. And when our eyes met, I realized ghosts don't need graves. They just need unfinished business. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that carried the weight of routine. Back-to-back meetings, half-hearted smiles, interviews where I pretended to believe my own success stories. The city was glittering in its usual way, like a liar showing off jewelry it didn't pay for. I was at the unveiling of a new design collaboration, surrounded by cameras, colleagues, and the comfortable arrogance that comes from knowing everyone in the room owes you something. The applause had just begun to fade when I saw her. At first I thought my mind was playing one of its cruel tricks again. I'd seen her before, in dreams, in mirrors when my reflection blurred, in faces that carried the same quiet intelligence. But this wasn't imagination. This was her. Anna. She was standing near the back of the room, half shadowed by the column of light from the projector. She looked older, yes, but not broken. Time had not punished her. It had refined her. Her hair was shorter now, her posture straighter, her gaze steadier than I remembered. She wore simplicity like it was armor. A black suit with clean lines, nothing extravagant, yet she pulled the attention of the entire room without trying. My pulse hammered in my throat as I tried to find breath. It felt as if 20 years collapsed into one impossible second, crushing me beneath the weight of everything I'd done. She didn't flinch when I looked at her. She just smiled. A small, controlled curve of her lips that carried more power than the cameras flashing around us. I froze. Every cell in my body screamed denial. Anna was dead. She was dead. I had seen the reports, the condolences, the memorial foundation her family set up in her name. But here she was, living proof that the grave I built for her in my guilt was empty. I managed to finish the presentation, my voice mechanical, my smile brittle. Every applause hit my ears like a verdict. When the event ended, I found myself scanning the crowd for her again, heart thudding like a trapped animal. She was gone. For a moment, I wondered if I had finally lost my mind. But when I stepped outside into the cold night, she was waiting for me, leaning against a sleek black car, arms folded, face illuminated by the city's pale glow. "Hello, Claire," she said, using my name like it was both a greeting and a reminder. The sound of her voice shattered me. It was the same, low, calm, deliberate. But underneath it was something new, composure sharpened into steel. "Anna," I whispered, barely believing it. "You're alive." She tilted her head slightly, that faint smile still in place. "I was always alive. You just stopped looking." The street around us blurred into insignificance. My lungs forgot their rhythm. "Where have you been?" I asked. "Building," she replied simply. "The way we used to, only this time no one took it from me." Her words landed like small, precise knives. I could feel the sting of each one. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw what I had missed all those years. She had built something of her own, quietly and deliberately. There were whispers in the industry about a rising brand that valued ethics over image, purpose over profit. I had dismissed it as idealistic nonsense. I never bothered to check who was behind it. Of course it was her. She didn't come closer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I heard your speech at the gala," she said. "You've become very good at them." "Anna," I began, the word breaking apart in my mouth. "I didn't know what happened. I thought—" She cut me off with a look. "You thought I was gone, so you didn't have to feel guilty anymore." I swallowed hard, guilt rising like bile. "I want to make it right," I said quickly. "I'll give you anything. Money, partnership, your name on everything. You deserve it. You—" "Stop!" Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the authority of finality. "You can't buy forgiveness, Claire." The words were simple, but they landed like thunder. My throat tightened. For the first time in years, I couldn't hide behind wealth or charm. I was standing naked in my truth, stripped of every excuse. "Then what do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I didn't come for revenge," she said softly. "I came for truth. For both of us." I stared at her, desperate to understand. What truth? The truth you've buried under your empire, she said. The one you write over every time you sign your name on something I created. Her calmness was unbearable. It wasn't hatred that terrified me. It was her peace. The woman I betrayed should have been angry, but anger is human, and forgiveness, even when withheld, belongs to the living. She was something else entirely. We stood in silence, the city's noise echoing around us, neon lights flickering across her face. I could smell the faint trace of rain in the air, the same scent that had haunted me since that night at the gala. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, plain, white, sealed. She held it out toward me. "What is it?" I asked, not reaching for it. "Something you wrote," she said. "And something I added." My hands trembled as I took it. The weight of it was wrong for something made of paper, heavier, thicker. I looked down at it and noticed my name written across the front, in my own handwriting. "How?" I started, but she interrupted. "I told you," she said quietly. "I came for truth." Her eyes softened, and for a moment I saw the girl who once believed in me, the girl who once called me her sister. "Open it when you're ready to face yourself." Before I could say another word, she turned and stepped into the car. The door closed with the softest click, and in that sound, I heard every unsaid apology I would never have the chance to make. The car pulled away, merging into the night, its taillights fading like the last traces of faith leaving a sinner's soul. I stood there on the sidewalk, holding the envelope like it was a live thing, something that might bite or burn. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't know whether I was breathing out of habit or survival. As I stared at my name written in my own handwriting, one thought burned through the fog of disbelief. How did she get this letter, the one I swore I had destroyed? The same people who once cheered for me now called me a thief, and the applause that once felt like thunder began to sound like mockery, echoing through an empty hall. It started with a single headline, just one article written by an online journalist hungry for clicks, claiming that my empire wasn't built on innovation, but on deceit. The headline was short, sharp, and venomous. "The Queen of Fashion built her throne on stolen dreams." I laughed at first. After all, I had survived worse. Scandal was currency in my world. We all traded it, controlled it, spun it until it glittered. But by the end of that same day, I realized this wasn't gossip. It was war. Within hours, social media became a battlefield. Hashtags with my name trended worldwide, every one of them soaked in accusation. People dissected old interviews, slowed down videos, analyzed my pauses, my smiles, my tone, looking for the lie. And they found it. Or rather, they decided they did. Screenshots of old contracts began circulating. Anonymous insiders posted stories about what really happened, and the internet, that machine of outrage, began to chew on me with a hunger that felt personal. By morning, every network was calling for statements. Former investors went silent. Brand partners canceled collaborations. Magazine covers I'd graced for years were pulled from shelves. My PR team tried to manage it. Press releases, legal threats, carefully worded apologies. But the more we spoke, the louder the noise became. The internet doesn't want explanations. It wants blood. I remember sitting in the conference room that overlooked the city, watching as news anchors discussed me like I was a crime scene. The skyline outside was pale, indifferent, a row of skyscrapers reflecting back my own emptiness. My lawyers talked about damage control, cease and desist letters, lawsuits against defamation. My head of marketing wept quietly in the corner. One of my oldest advisors, a man who once toasted to my genius, wouldn't even meet my eyes. "Claire," he said finally, his voice low, "if even half of this is true, we're finished." Half. The word stung because he was right. Half was true. Half was enough. By the end of that week, the board forced me to step down as CEO. My resignation statement went live at midnight, ghostwritten by a publicist who was paid to sound sincere. I am stepping back to reflect, rebuild trust, and take responsibility for my actions. it said. The truth behind those words was simpler. I had been exiled from the empire I built, dethroned by my own past. Endorsements vanished overnight. Banks froze assets. Charities quietly removed my name from their donor plaques. Even the causes I had genuinely cared for turned their backs, because morality in business isn't about truth. It's about optics. I watched as people who had once sworn loyalty deleted our photos, unfollowed me, erased the evidence that they had ever stood beside me. It was as if I had never existed. And yet, the silence of betrayal wasn't the worst part. It was the noise, the endless voices, strangers dissecting my life, turning my guilt into entertainment. Old interviews replayed with new captions, lies we believed. Every smile, every gesture now looked sinister. They said I was manipulative, narcissistic, predatory. Maybe I was. Maybe success had always required me to be. But the cruelty of the crowd wasn't about truth. It was about ritual. They needed to burn someone, and I was the most convenient match. Friends who had built their fortunes alongside mine called to say they were taking a step back for now. Investors who once boasted about my instincts now called me reckless. Even my family, the few who still spoke to me, begged me to leave the city until things calmed down. But things like this don't calm down. They devour until there's nothing left to feed on. The lawsuits came next. Anna's brand had become the face of ethics and transparency, and now the press connected her success to my downfall with a poetic kind of cruelty. Justice served, one article read. I wondered if she had read it. I wondered if she smiled. My offices emptied. Staff resigned, citing personal reasons. The security guards who once stood at attention now avoided my gaze. The morning I returned to collect my belongings, my nameplate had already been removed from the glass door. It was lying on my desk, face down, as if even the building wanted to erase me. I took one last walk through the showroom where it had all begun. Rows of designs, mannequins wearing ghosts of ideas I once believed in. Each one stared blankly ahead, elegant and lifeless, like the version of me the world had fallen in love with. I wanted to feel anger, to scream about loyalty, but all I could feel was the quiet humiliation of being seen for what I really was. At home, the silence was suffocating. Reporters camped outside the gates, drones hovered for photographs, and my phone never stopped vibrating with messages I couldn't bear to read. My face was on every channel, every feed. The comments blurred together. Thief, liar, fraud, monster. The world I had conquered was now tearing me apart piece by piece, and I realized something terrifying. Fame and shame are twins. They just wear different makeup. Days turned into weeks. My bank accounts dwindled as legal fees multiplied. I sold one property, then another. But it wasn't the money that broke me. It was the reflection. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my dressing room and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were dull, her mouth drawn into a grim line. I leaned closer, searching for the power I used to carry in my posture, the confidence I used to radiate like perfume. It was gone. What remained was a stranger, hollow and tired, someone who had built everything the world admired but had no idea who she was without it. I reached for the mirror, tracing the edge of my reflection, and whispered, "Who are you now?" The silence that followed was unbearable. The only answer came from the faint hum of the city outside, a city that once belonged to me, now carrying on as if I had never existed. I thought that was the end. I thought I had already lost everything worth losing. But one evening, as I sat in the dim light of my empty living room surrounded by unopened legal letters, my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in me, some instinct, some dread made me answer. "Claire," a voice said. Calm, controlled, professional. "I'm calling on behalf of Ms. Anna Reed." My breath caught. The lawyer continued. "She'd like to meet." Privately. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone in my hand, my pulse roaring in my ears. After all these years, after all the silence and all the ruin, she was calling for me. Just when I thought it was over, when the world had already buried me, Anna's lawyer called with 5 words that made my heart stop. She wants to meet privately. I had 2 choices, run or confess. I chose to destroy myself, because sometimes the only way to end a lie is to burn down the person who built it. For weeks after Anna's lawyer called, I lived in a fog that had no beginning and no end. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. Every sound, the buzz of my phone, the creak of the stairs, the rain tapping against the windows, sounded like a verdict. I had spent my entire life controlling stories, but now the story was controlling me. It was bigger, hungrier, and crueler than anything I had ever written about myself. When the scandals first broke, I thought the world had seen the worst of me. But the silence that followed Anna's request for a private meeting was worse than exposure. Silence, I learned, is a weapon that cuts slower, deeper. I waited for her call. I waited for her message. None came. Instead, her lawyer sent a brief note. She prefers not to meet at this time. I stared at those words until they blurred, until I realized that the woman I had wronged most didn't even hate me enough to confront me. Something inside me broke that day. I sat in my home office, surrounded by reminders of a life that no longer belonged to me. Awards stacked in dusty corners, photographs where my smile looked too sharp to be sincere, headlines printed and framed like a museum of illusions. Every piece of it was a monument to the person I had pretended to be. And as I stared at those walls, I realized the one thing I had never given anyone was truth. I had sold beauty, resilience, power, but not honesty. That night, I made a decision. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, just for release. I called my remaining assistant, the only one who hadn't resigned yet, and told her to set up a camera. No studio, no lighting, no production. I wanted raw honesty, stripped bare of gloss and reputation. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, but nodded, as if she understood I wasn't asking. I was confessing. When the camera's red light blinked on, I didn't have a script. For once, I didn't plan my sentences. I looked straight into the lens, into the eyes of millions of people who had once worshipped me, and I told them everything. I told them about Anna, her brilliance, her faith in me, the trust I had stolen. I told them about the contracts, the manipulation, the lies I built my empire on. I told them that every dollar I earned had been paid for with someone else's pain. The words poured out like blood from a wound that had been festering for years. I spoke until my throat burned and my voice cracked, until my mascara ran in uneven rivers down my face. I removed my jewelry. I pulled my hair back. I made myself look like the woman I used to be before the money, before the fame. Just a desperate dreamer trying to be seen. When I finished, I didn't know what I had done. I sat there, staring at the silent camera, breathing in the heavy air that followed my own undoing. My assistant uploaded the video before I could change my mind. She whispered, "Are you sure?" I nodded. "If they're going to destroy me," I said, "let them destroy the truth, not the lie." Within an hour, it was everywhere. The video spread faster than any marketing campaign I had ever created. Millions watched. The comments came in waves: shock, anger, disbelief. People dissected every frame, every tear, every pause. News anchors played it on repeat. Analysts debated my sincerity. Psychologists analyzed my body language. For the first time, the world saw me without filters, without polish, without armor. And the strangest thing happened. After the initial explosion of noise came silence. No one called. No one knocked. The phone stopped buzzing. The world had seen my confession, and then it turned away, like it couldn't decide whether to forgive or forget. And somehow, that silence hurt more than hate ever could. I stayed offline for days, watching the numbers climb. Views in the millions, then tens of millions. Hashtags born, hashtags buried. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had an answer. I had given them truth. And truth, it seemed, didn't fit neatly into their need for villains and heroes. Then came the letters. Some were from strangers, people who said they saw themselves in my mistakes, people who told me they forgave me even though I hadn't asked them to. Others were threats, furious messages from those who had lost money, faith, admiration. I read every one because I believed I deserved to. But one letter was different. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, and when I opened it, I recognized the handwriting instantly. Anna's. Inside, just one line. You told the world what you did. Now tell yourself why. I cried harder at that single sentence than I had through the entire video. Because she was right. I had confessed, but I hadn't reflected. I had destroyed my image, but I still hadn't faced the person underneath it. In the days that followed, journalists camped outside my house, demanding interviews, exclusives, redemption arcs. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to perform honesty for an audience. I wanted to feel it in silence. I spent hours watching the video on repeat, analyzing my own face the way I used to analyze competitors. Every twitch, every tremor, every flicker of guilt. It was painful to see how much of my sorrow still looked rehearsed. I thought the confession would free me, but instead it stripped me of the illusion of freedom. When the cameras stopped, the guilt remained. I wrote to Anna every day after that. Letters I never sent. Letters that began as apologies and ended as confessions I didn't know how to say aloud. In one of them, I told her I'd give up everything, every penny, every property, every legacy, if she would just speak to me again. I sealed it, left it on my desk, and stared at it for hours. Then, finally, I mailed it. Days passed, weeks even. I checked the mail every morning like an addict, waiting for something, anything. The world had moved on, found a new scandal to feed on. But I was still here, in this mausoleum of a house, haunted by the sound of my own voice echoing from a confession I couldn't take back. And then, one morning, as I opened my mailbox, there it was. An envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. No sender, no clue. Just my name, written in blue ink across the front. I held it for a long time before I opened it, my heart hammering in a rhythm that felt too familiar. Weeks of silence had convinced me I'd been forgotten, until that letter arrived, and the first line made my knees give way. She said she's ready to see you. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any answer, and when it finally breaks, it can sound like both mercy and punishment. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, no emblem, just my name written in calm, deliberate handwriting that I hadn't seen in decades. It wasn't the kind of letter you could mistake for junk or business. It carried weight, as if the paper itself was aware of what it contained. I knew before I even opened it that it was from her, from Anna. For days, I had lived in the echo of my confession video. The world had grown quiet. The media had exhausted itself, and strangers online had moved on to newer scandals. My house had become a mausoleum of regrets, the air thick with the residue of everything I'd destroyed. I had begged for Anna's response, through letters, through silence, through prayer, but nothing came. Until now. I took the letter to my study, sat down at the old oak desk that once symbolized my control over everything, and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no closing, just one sentence, written in the kind of handwriting that used to fill our studio walls with blueprints and hope. Forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something you earn. That was it. No anger, no softness, no promise of reconciliation. Just a truth sharp enough to draw blood. I read the sentence again and again until the words blurred. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't acceptance either. It was an invitation, a challenge. Earn it. How do you earn forgiveness from someone whose life you shattered? From someone who rebuilt herself without you, stronger and purer than the empire you stole? Then, beneath the signature, I saw something else written in smaller print. An address. I recognized it instantly. The garage. The place where it all began. I didn't hesitate. The next morning I drove across the city, past the skyline that had once been my crown. Every billboard I used to dominate now showed faces I didn't recognize. Success, I realized, is an inheritance that always finds new heirs. When I reached the old neighborhood, it was like stepping into a photograph that had faded around the edges. The streets were narrower, the colors dimmer. I parked outside the same rusting metal door we used to unlock with frozen fingers, the one that used to groan like an old soul when it opened. The lock was still broken, just as we had left it years ago. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dust. The air was thick, untouched for years. The smell of oil and damp cardboard hung like ghosts of old ambition. Light poured through a cracked skylight, catching particles of dust that shimmered in the air like forgotten memories. In the corner, our old workbench still stood, its surface scarred by blades, glue, and midnight ideas. Faded blueprints were pinned to the wall, edges curled, ink smudged, names half erased by time. I saw her handwriting everywhere, notes written in pencil, measurements in her neat, meticulous script. My handwriting was there too, messier, more impulsive, side by side with hers, a visual reminder of how we once fit together perfectly, chaos and order. I walked slowly, touching the remnants of the life we had built. The old coffee mugs still sat on the shelf. One of them had my initials scratched into the side. The other said, "Don't quit your dream." She had given me that mug the night we decided to launch our first design. I remember how she laughed when I told her it looked cheap. Now I ran my thumb over the faded letters, feeling the crack near the handle, and it felt like holding her heart in my hands. Everything here was a time capsule, and I was the intruder. As I stood there, surrounded by the ruins of what we once dreamed, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim of my past. I felt like a thief standing in the evidence of her own crime scene. There was no trace of Anna herself, no fresh footprints in the dust, no sign that she had been here recently. But she had left me a message. This place. She wanted me to see what I'd taken, to remember who I was before greed rewired my heart. I sat down on the floor, cross-legged like we used to when brainstorming late into the night. I tried to imagine what she must have felt when she realized what I had done. Betrayal has many shades, but the one that hurts most is disbelief. The moment when love and loyalty collide and the world no longer makes sense. I had been the cause of that. I stayed there until the sunlight began to fade, and when the cold crept in, I took out my notebook and began to write. Not a speech, not a press statement, not another performance. A letter. I told her everything I couldn't say before. I told her how every success had tasted like ash, how every applause had felt like a reminder that I didn't deserve to exist in her story. I told her I wanted to give her everything, every dollar, every patent, every building with my name on it, if it meant I could start again as the person she once believed in. I didn't ask for forgiveness this time. I asked for permission to atone. When I finished, my hand was shaking, ink smudged along my fingers. I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a plain envelope, and wrote her name across the front. Then I left it on the old workbench, weighed down with the cracked coffee mug that said, "Don't quit your dream." As I turned to leave, I glanced around the room one last time. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt sacred, like the beginning of an ending that needed to happen. That night, back home, I fell asleep with the smallest glimmer of peace I'd felt in years. It wasn't happiness. It was surrender. Maybe this was how redemption began, not with applause, but with silence. When I woke the next morning, the peace had vanished. My assistant was at the door, pale, holding a thick envelope she said had arrived by courier. I recognized the legal firm's seal before she spoke. "It's from Anna's attorney," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. My fingers trembled as I took it. The weight was heavy, heavier than guilt. I looked down and saw my name typed across the front. Claire Donovan vs. Reed Designs International. I tore open the envelope with shaking hands, only to find a single sentence at the top of the document. "This is not revenge, it's restitution." I thought forgiveness was given with words. I was wrong. It demanded everything I had, everything I had ever called mine, and everything I had stolen to feel alive. The letter from Anna's attorney sat on my desk like a live grenade. I had opened it with trembling hands, expecting vengeance, lawsuits, financial ruin, maybe even prison. What I found instead was something far more devastating. It wasn't revenge, it was an invitation. The words were clinical, precise, legal, but beneath the ink I could hear her voice. "You can't undo what you did, but you can give it back, every part of it. If you truly meant what you said, prove it." For a long time, I just sat there staring at the paper. My mind tried to calculate what that would mean, how much it would cost, what would be left of me afterward. But the math didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't counting numbers. I was counting the weight of my sins. I called my lawyers the next morning. They arrived in tailored suits, holding their confidence like armor, ready to fight. When I told them my decision, silence filled the room like a slow explosion. "You want to give it all away?" my lead attorney asked, blinking as if he hadn't heard me right. "Yes," I said quietly. "Everything." "Ms. Donovan, that's not generosity. That's insanity. You're talking about transferring full ownership, your patents, your properties, your trademarks, your personal accounts, everything you've built." "I didn't build it," I said, my voice steady. "She did." They exchanged looks, the kind that say she's breaking. Maybe I was. But for once, the breaking felt right. We spent hours drafting documents, outlining transfers, and reviewing clauses that would make the process irreversible. Each page they slid toward me was another layer of my old self peeling away. I signed them all, one by one, without hesitation. My signature, once a symbol of power, now felt like surrender. By evening, my lawyers had stopped arguing. They'd realized there was no convincing me. "You'll be left with nothing," one of them said finally, his voice almost gentle. "Then maybe," I replied, "I'll finally have something real." When the paperwork was complete, I looked around my office. The glass walls, the skyline view, the plaques that praised a life built on deceit. It didn't look like power anymore. It looked like a cage I had mistaken for a kingdom. I dismissed my staff, one by one, with handshakes and quiet apologies. Some looked at me with pity, others with confusion. They didn't understand that I wasn't being noble. I was simply tired of carrying what didn't belong to me. The last document I signed was the transfer of my company's ownership to Anna Reed, formerly my ghost, now my rightful successor. I didn't call her. I didn't email her. This wasn't a gesture for approval. It was an act of restitution. I refused all publicity. No press conference, no photo op, no carefully worded speech about new beginnings. The world didn't need to see this. It wasn't their story to witness. That night, I sat alone in my now empty office, staring at the skyline for what I knew would be the last time. The city had changed color. The glass towers that once reflected my ambition now looked softer, quieter, as if they no longer recognized me. For years, I believed that power was freedom. But power had only chained me to the version of myself I hated most. For the first time in decades, I felt light. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was something purer, a kind of weightlessness that came from no longer pretending to deserve everything I had. The next morning, I placed all the signed papers in a leather envelope. I wrote a short note on top. Just one sentence, the only one that mattered. Now you own what was always yours. I took a cab downtown to her office, which occupied a minimalist space in a building that used to house one of my own showrooms. How poetic, I thought, that I would be returning everything inside walls once built to glorify me. When I stepped inside, the receptionist looked up, startled. She recognized me. Everyone did. But she didn't say a word. I handed her the envelope. "For Ms. Reed," I said simply. She hesitated, her eyes flicking from me to the name on the folder. "Would you like me to tell her you're here?" I shook my head. "No, she'll understand." Then I turned and walked away. Outside, the air smelled different, like rain mixed with asphalt and relief. I walked without a plan, without a destination, through streets that once felt too small for my ego, but now felt wide enough to breathe in. I passed shop windows displaying designs eerily similar to my early work, young designers selling dreams I once believed were mine alone. I smiled, not in envy, but in understanding. Creation doesn't belong to anyone forever. It only passes through us. As I crossed the street, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a storefront window. I almost didn't recognize her. The woman staring back had no jewelry, no carefully arranged hair, no trace of the billionaire mask I'd worn for so long. She looked older, yes, but also real. I touched the glass and whispered to the reflection, "You're free." That evening, I returned home to the mansion that had once been filled with noise and light. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. I wasn't saying goodbye to a place. I was saying goodbye to an identity. I left the doors unlocked. On the table by the front door, I placed the keys, my phone, and a small envelope containing enough cash for a train ticket. I didn't know where I would go, and for once, that uncertainty didn't terrify me. Before I left, I looked around one last time. Every object in that house had a story. Stories of deceit, ambition, fear. But tonight they were just things. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to own them. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The city stretched ahead, vast and indifferent. Somewhere inside those walls, Anna was opening the envelope that would return to her everything she'd lost. And somewhere deep inside me, something fragile and true began to breathe again. As I disappeared into the city night, leaving my fortune and name behind, I imagined the moment she'd read my note. "Now you own what was always yours." And I wondered if she'd understand that, in giving her everything, I had finally given myself back too. Sometimes forgiveness arrives, but you're no longer there to receive it, and it feels less like a blessing and more like a gentle farewell whispered across a closing door. It had been nearly 8 months since I'd left. The city, the noise, the scandal, the empire that had collapsed in on itself. My name no longer belonged to headlines. My face no longer haunted screens. I vanished from the world in the quietest way possible, dissolving into a version of life that didn't demand applause to feel real. The town I chose was small and hidden, perched along the coast where the sea spoke softly against the rocks, and the horizon seemed to hold its breath between storms. No one here cared who I used to be. To them, I was just Claire, the quiet woman who rented a tiny cottage near the harbor and spent her mornings painting in the sunlight that slipped through lace curtains. I started teaching art to children at the local community center, small hands smudging color across paper, laughter spilling like music. They didn't know about the magazines, or the money, or the betrayal that had once defined me. To them, I was simply someone who could show them how to make the ocean blue look alive. Every time they smiled, something inside me softened. For the first time in decades, I felt useful without being powerful. But peace, I learned, isn't the absence of consequence. It's just the quiet before your heart remembers what it's lost. My health had begun to falter, not long after I left everything behind. It started with exhaustion. Then came the coughing, the dizziness, the days when even painting felt like a battle. The doctors in town were kind but vague. Words like degenerative and advanced floated through sterile rooms. I didn't ask for timelines. I didn't need one. I had lived too long trying to bargain with time. Now, I wanted to surrender to it. I spent my evenings watching the tide, writing letters I'd never send, painting seascapes that looked like forgiveness, the kind I still couldn't find within myself. I didn't know where Anna was, or what she thought of my disappearance. The last thing I had given her was the company, the patents, the empire that bore her name once again. I imagined she was thriving, reclaiming her world. That thought gave me peace. Until the afternoon she appeared. It was a gray day, the kind where the horizon melts into the sea, and I was packing away brushes when a soft knock came at the studio door. I thought it was one of the children forgetting something. But when I opened it, the air seemed to vanish from the room. There she was. Anna. Time had touched her too, but gently. Her face was older, more defined, the lines around her eyes shaped by resilience instead of regret. She wore a long coat the color of sand after rain. For a moment, we just stood there, two women bound by everything we couldn't undo. "You found me," I whispered. "I wasn't looking," she said softly. "I just knew where to go when I was ready." We sat by the window, the sea breathing against the shore outside, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. I studied her hands, the same hands that once drew the designs I stole, the same hands that had rebuilt a life without me. They rested calmly in her lap, steady and sure. Finally, she broke the silence. "I came to tell you something," she said. My chest tightened. I braced for anger, for judgment, for something that would shatter this fragile calm. But instead, she looked at me with eyes that held no fire, just exhaustion and grace. "I forgive you," she said. The words landed softly, but they hit like thunder inside me. My throat closed. I shook my head, tears spilling before I could stop them. "No," I said, my voice breaking. Don't forgive me. I don't deserve it." She smiled sadly. "It's not for you, Claire. It's for me. Carrying hatred takes energy I no longer want to give. I can't change what you did, but I can choose what it does to me." I pressed a hand to my heart, as if I could hold it together. "I gave you everything," I whispered. "I know," she said, "but that was never what I needed." Her calmness broke me more than anger ever could have. I sobbed quietly, the sound of the waves outside filling the spaces between my breaths. "I ruined you," I said. She reached across the table and touched my hand lightly. "No, you ruined yourself. I just stopped following you into the fire." We sat there in silence again, our fingers barely touching, our hearts speaking all the words our pride had swallowed years ago. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, but she already knew. I wanted to ask if she could ever see me as the woman I once was, but I didn't deserve that kindness. The light outside shifted, turning gold against the waves. She stood to leave, and I felt panic surge through me. "Anna," I said, my voice shaking, "will I ever see you again?" She paused at the doorway. "Maybe," she said softly. "But even if we never meet again, know this. You're not the worst thing you've done. You're the choice you make after." I nodded, tears blurring her outline until she looked like a memory fading back into the horizon. She hesitated, then smiled once more. The same quiet smile she wore the first day we dreamed together in that dusty garage. And then she was gone. I sat alone long after she left, the sound of the ocean carrying her words back to me in waves. "I forgive you." That night, the pain in my chest grew heavier. I lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the old shutters, feeling the ache of both peace and regret. I thought about the empire, the applause, the wealth, all of it gone. And yet, here in this small, borrowed life, I finally felt something that resembled grace. My breathing grew shallow, my body weak, but my heart strangely light. I thought of her face one last time, of the girl she once was, and the woman she had become, and I whispered into the dark, "If you can forgive me, I'll give up everything." The words floated into the night, carried by the same wind that had brought her back to me. I don't know if she heard them, but I hope she did. As my eyes closed and the world dimmed around me, the sound of the waves grew softer, until all that was left was her voice echoing through the dark, answering a prayer I would never live to hear. When she died, the world forgot her name, but not her story. And in the silence she left behind, I discovered that forgiveness, once spoken, can echo louder than vengeance ever could. It has been 3 months since Claire's death. I still find myself pausing before I say her name aloud, as if the air might crack under the weight of it. The news called it a quiet passing, a vague phrase for something so final. They wrote short obituaries filled with polite sentences and distant facts. Claire Donovan, philanthropist and former CEO, dies at 61. No mention of the scandal, the confession, or the empire she gave away. They buried her as they once praised her, in headlines that never touched the truth. But truth doesn't fade when people stop saying it. It lingers in the spaces where silence once lived. I was the one who found her final letter. The local postmaster called me after her death, saying a package had been left with my name and no return address. Inside was a single envelope, aged, folded carefully, sealed with wax. I didn't open it right away. I waited until I could sit by the ocean, the same ocean that had been her final witness. The sky was gray that morning, heavy with rain that refused to fall. When I broke the seal, her handwriting met me like a whisper I'd been avoiding for half my life. She didn't ask for forgiveness this time. She didn't justify or explain. She just wrote about peace, how she had found it in simplicity, in teaching, in children's laughter, how the absence of luxury had taught her the presence of truth. She wrote that she had learned to love again, not in grand gestures or gifts, but in the quiet act of creating something honest. "If I've earned even a shadow of redemption," she wrote, "it's because I finally understood that love without truth is just performance." By the time I reached the last line, I was crying so hard that the ink blurred. Her final words were the same ones she had spoken to me years ago, the same ones she had carried to her grave. "If you can forgive me, I'll give up everything." She had meant it. She already had. I kept the letter close for days. Then, after the funeral, I went back to the city she had abandoned and walked through what remained of her empire. The offices were empty, the walls stripped bare, her name quietly erased from the building directory. In the conference room, I found her chair still pushed back, a single pen resting where her hand must have left it. There was no portrait, no monument, only the faint smell of perfume that lingered in the air, a ghost made of memory. The mansion she once lived in was auctioned, its windows shuttered, its hallways hollow. I walked through it once before the new owners took possession. Dust covered the Oahu marble floors. The chandeliers were dim with neglect. But in her old study, I found the computer she had used for her confession video. The file was still there. Out of instinct, or maybe something deeper, I clicked play. The screen lit up, and there she was. No makeup, no jewelry, just Claire. The woman I once loved as a friend, envied as a rival, hated as a thief, and finally forgave as a human being. Her voice trembled as she spoke, raw and unfiltered. I had seen that video when the world first did, but watching it now felt different. Back then, it was scandal. Now, it was scripture. She wasn't defending herself or asking for sympathy. She was documenting her transformation. Every pause, every tear, every stumble in her words was real. I understood then why so many people had said they felt peace watching it. It wasn't the story of her fall. It was the story of her awakening. When I left the mansion that evening, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't resurrect her reputation. and I didn't want to. But I could make her story mean something more than guilt and downfall. 2 months later, I launched the Donovan Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to women in business ethics, mentorship, and creative integrity. It wasn't about glorifying her. It was about learning from her mistakes. Success without conscience isn't success, the mission statement read. Those words were hers, taken from a draft speech she'd never delivered. The world responded in ways I didn't expect. Her confession video resurfaced online, shared across social media with captions like "The Cost of Redemption" and "The Truth Behind the Billionaire's Last Words." People debated her morality, her courage, her flaws. Some called her a fraud, even in death. Others called her a prophet. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that people were finally talking about truth. Not the kind that trends, but the kind that transforms. Teenagers began quoting her in classroom essays. Business leaders cited her as a warning and a lesson. Artists painted her final words onto murals in cities she once ruled through ads. "If you can forgive me, I'll give up everything." Her mansion, now owned by strangers, became a pilgrimage site for some, an odd mix of worship and reflection. The new owners found the walls scratched with notes, letters, even poems left by visitors who claimed her story helped them face their own mistakes. They said they felt her presence in the quiet, the kind of peace that comes only after surrender. I still visit her grave sometimes, tucked away on a hill that overlooks the ocean. There's no grand monument, just a flat stone carved with her name and the words she lived and died by. Forgiveness isn't surrender. It's freedom. I often bring flowers, not roses. She hated roses. But wild lilies, the kind that grow freely near the shore. Standing there, I sometimes talk to her. I tell her how the foundation is growing, how her video still inspires those who once mocked her. I tell her that she was right about peace, that it doesn't come from wealth or fame, but from truth spoken too late to save you, yet just in time to save someone else. And when I leave, I always glance back at the horizon. The waves crash against the rocks in a rhythm that sounds like breathing, and for a fleeting second, I swear I hear her voice carried in the wind. Soft, steady, unbroken. The screen fades to black on her final written words, scrawled across the letter that began it all. "If you can forgive me, I'll give up everything." And in that silence, the world finally learns that some confessions never end. They just keep echoing through the hearts brave enough to listen. If this story touched something inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Tell me in the comments, what does forgiveness mean to you? Share this video with someone who needs to hear her words tonight. And if you want more stories that speak to the heart, subscribe, because every week we uncover another truth the world tried to forget.